Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Monica Wedlock Kilpatrick, and I serve as the Associate Vice President of Organizational and Leadership Development for the National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. The NBA is a health and social service general ministry of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and our mission is to inspire and connect the people and ministries of the church in the creation of communities of compassion and care, as well as to advocate for the well-being of all humanity. For over 130 years, NBA has been called to care for the least of these and to root all of our initiatives in the value and dignity of human life and serving a world that God so loves. To accomplish this, it takes more than compassion and empathy. It creates a responsibility to act in creating equity and justice for everyone. As we get started, I would like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the NBA website. Also, you may follow along via transcript using Otter AI. Click the Otter AI icon at the top of your screen and select the View Transcript option. A new window will open and the transcript will populate automatically. Today's topic is the privatization of prisons. The United States is the world's largest private prison population. And according to the Sentencing Project, more than 120,000 incarcerated individuals are held in for-profit prisons. Not to mention, billions of dollars in revenue are paid to private corporations that own these prisons. This webinar will address the growing problem of the use of for-profit prisons, why faith-based communities should be concerned about them, and what actions can be taken to reduce the impact these private companies have on an already strained and dysfunctional correction system. We hope that this webinar will be used as a tool for discussion and a call to action in your local communities, congregations, regions, and even in general church ministries. At the end of this presentation, we will try to make time for questions. Throughout the webinar, if you have questions that emerge, we welcome you to use the Q&A feature by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. Please include your email address so that if we are unable to respond to your question, we can follow up with you directly after the webinar is over. And to request technical assistance, you may also use the Q&A feature. Again, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for future viewing on the NBA website in the coming weeks. At this time, I will briefly introduce our speakers. Dr. Jennifer Ortiz, Ph.D., Indiana University Criminology and Justice Department Program Coordinator. Dr. Ortiz is an assistant professor of criminology at the University of Indiana Southeast. Her research interests center on punishment in the criminal justice system from sentencing through reentry. She earned her doctorate in criminal justice from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And before joining the faculty, Dr. Ortiz served as a research director for the New York State Permanent Commission on Sentencing from 2011 to 2015. She's a highly sought speaker and workshop leader in the field of criminal justice. And we thank you for being again with us, Dr. Ortiz. Reverend Tiffany Curtis, MBA Prison and Jail Peer Group Convener, but she's also trained as a clinical chaplain and spiritual director and has worked extensively as a community organizer and in prisons. She has ongoing commitments to grassroots community work in the US, Ecuador, and Honduras. Tiffany grew up in Los Angeles in a bilingual family and in an immigrant congregation. Tiffany's also the pastor of First Christian Church of Santa Fe and is the co-founder and lead organizer of the Santa Fe Faith Network of Immigrant Justice. Tiffany holds a BA from Chapman University in Peace Studies and Latin American Studies and an MDiv from Harvard University. She hopes to facilitate courageous and sacred spaces of communal healing through contemplation and action. Tiffany is nourished by a committed yoga practice, quality time with loved ones, and hiking on the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Thank you, Tiffany, for being with us. Our moderator for today's conversation is Reverend Dean Bucalis, MBA Mission Specialist for our Prison and Jail Ministries. At this time, I'll turn the conversation over to you, Dean, and then our presenters.
Thank you, Monica. We are very fortunate to have two outstanding and knowledgeable speakers to lead us in this conversation this afternoon. The MBA has created over a period of years a webinar series that address issues of injustice as they relate to prison and jail ministries. You can find some of these webinar videos on the NBA website. We've covered topics of including the growing number of women in prisons and jails, the Bail Project, mass incarceration in the United States, the prison abolition movement, and restorative justice. Today, we learn about the privatization of prisons and immigration detention centers in the United States as a part of the wider prison industrial complex. We'll learn from Dr. Ortiz how it came about and the damage that it is doing. And from Reverend Curtis, we're going to learn what effective ways the people of God can address this injustice in their own communities. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Ortiz as she leads us in this conversation. Thanks to both of you.
And thank you to Dean and Monica for putting this together, and for Will, our RT guy, who you can't see, who helped us through a bunch of glitches before we even started today. So thank you to him. I want to start off by talking about what privatization is. So for the purposes of my presentation, privatization will refer to the transferring of responsibility for criminal justice services to for-profit corporations. And while this presentation is about the privatization of prisons specifically, I plan to speak about the privatization of corrections more broadly speaking. And so, if I can, let me go to full screen mode again. My apologies. There we go. So just to give you an overview, I'll start off with the history of privatization, how it is that we got to the point where we are today, and then I'll talk about the effects of privatization in 3 different ways. First, beginning with what's happening inside of the correctional facilities, and then looking at what is the effect of privatization post-release, so what happens when an incarcerated person is released to society, and then lastly, I'll look at what are the effects of privatization on society? Why should we all care about this issue? And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, who will explain to you what it is we can do, what are tangible action steps we can take. And so to understand the privatization of prisons, we have to understand that this history started in 1965. In 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson declared a war on crime that ushered in a new Teflon crime ideology. Prior to this point, we treated many of the individuals that are currently incarcerated, we treated them through a medical model of treatment. And that really begins to change with this war on crime. But it's accelerated even more by President Richard Nixon's 1971 declaration of a war on drugs. So the war on crime, coupled with the war on drugs, paved way for what we know today as mass incarceration. So in 1970, the United States incarcerated just over 200,000 individuals. By 1980, that number was 500,000. By 1989, we hit 1 million incarcerated persons. And today we have 2.3 million incarcerated individuals nationwide. That is an 11-fold or 1,100% increase in the incarcerated population over a 50-year period. And this 11-fold increase caused a ballooning of state correctional budgets. And by 2018, the United States was spending $81 billion per year on incarceration and another $200 billion on law enforcement, courts, and other criminal justice services. So as states struggled, really beginning in the early 1980s, to fund their ballooning criminal justice budgets, state legislatures sought remedies to this growing financial crisis. And unfortunately, the remedy they chose was not to de-incarcerate. Their remedy was to look to the private sector, which they believed could provide these services at a much lower cost. And in 1984, the US builds its first private prison. I apologize, I'm having some issues with screen function here. But in 1984, the first private prison is built in Tennessee. And over the next 6 years, from 1984 to 1990, an additional 66 for-profit prisons were constructed nationwide. So we went from having no for-profit prisons to having 66 in a short 6-year period. Today, private companies operate hundreds of correctional facilities, private probation departments, and immigration detention facilities nationwide. And two corporations that I will focus on, or you'll hear me reference multiple times, is CoreCivic and GEO Group. CoreCivic was formerly known as Corrections Corporation of America, but following a whole host of lawsuits and bad press, they rebranded themselves as CoreCivic. But these two corporations own over 50% of all for-profit private criminal justice services in the country. In 2016, they reported a combined $3.5 billion in revenue. Now, these are publicly traded companies, meaning that you can purchase stock in these companies on the stock market, which means that they're not answerable to the public taxpayer. They're answerable only to their stockholders, which you'll see shortly why that's problematic. But currently, 8.5% of the incarcerated population in the United States is housed in a for-profit prison, approximately 120,000 individuals. But perhaps even more disturbing is that 73% of those in immigration detention facilities nationwide are currently housed in a privately owned for-profit facility. Between the year 2000 and 2016, we saw a dramatic boom nationwide in the use of for-profit prisons. Arizona led that increase. So Arizona witnessed a 479% increase in the use of private prison beds in the state. And so although state legislatures believed that privatizing criminal justice service would result in cost savings, the privatization really that cost savings has never actually occurred. And so I want to show you the ways that Corrections Corporation of America and CoreCivic measure their profits. So this slide shows you total profits for CCA or CoreCivic and GEO Group. And you'll notice that in 2015, CCA made $222 million in profits off of incarceration, and GEO Group made $139 million in profits. And I show you this slide because it really gets to the moral issue behind privatization. They're measuring profits per body, per incarcerated person. The more incarcerated people they have in their facilities, the higher their profit margins actually become. And this is really a corruption of our concept of justice or our notion of justice. We believe as US citizens that in this notion of justice, when in reality what's happening in these private prisons is not actually justice. And there are many negative effects rather of privatization inside of correctional facilities. So the image you see on your screen right now was actually drawn by a currently incarcerated person. He was trying to show what the prison industrial complex looks like with a specific focus on forced labor, which he refers to as slave labor. But within these facilities, individuals earn very little money and they're forced to work. So you'll notice on his image, he said that he makes 19 cents an hour for his labor with no benefits, no medical, no vacations. And worse yet, it's not just that they're paid next to nothing for their labor, it's that they have to work. And so the penalty for refusing to work can be very extreme. One of the penalties can be placement into solitary confinement or a segregated housing unit, which they refer to as SHU inside of correctional facilities. But solitary confinement has detrimental impacts on a person's mental and physical health. And so this is problematic to punish them for not engaging in this slave labor or forced labor. Then there's the issue that they can actually lose good time And they can be denied parole. So the private company that owns the prison can go to the parole board and tell the parole board that the individual is a less than ideal inmate because they refuse to work. And then the individual can actually end up serving more time than they would have if they were in a public facility based on their refusal to work. A third punishment for refusing to work is not being allowed to participate in any existing programs within the prison. So not only are they forced to work, but if they don't work, then they're denied programming that they need in order to be successful upon their release. Another issue inside of private prisons is safety. And this is a major issue. Study after study shows us that there's more violence inside of privately owned facilities than there are in publicly owned facilities. So a study by the Department of Justice revealed that privatized prisons have higher rates of prisoner on prisoner, prisoner on staff, and staff on prisoner assaults than federally owned public prisons. The increase in violence is in part caused by understaffing and high turnover rates. So correctional staff in private prisons earn $24,000 less per year than those in the public sector. What this means is you can't expect highly qualified individuals if you're severely underpaying them. And when individuals do become correctional officers in private prisons, there's really high staff turnover rate. So turnover rate in private facilities is 52%. So 1 out of every 2 officers who starts at a private prison will leave a private prison. That is 3 times higher than the rate at public facilities. And this is problematic because we know that officers who have more experience on the job better understand how to exist within that environment. So they're less likely to use violence than those who are recently hired. Furthermore, staff at private prisons receive on average 12 weeks less training than those in public facilities. So they're underpaid, they're not well trained, and they're highly likely to leave. So many of these private facilities become what we call gladiator schools, where if there is a physical altercation between 2 incarcerated persons in the facility, the correctional officers allow them to continue fighting. Once the fight is over, then the correctional officer steps in. So we have recorded videos of assaults that took minutes before an officer actually responded. And to understand why private prisons do this, you have to understand that labor costs account for 60 to 70% of all correctional spending. So if your concern is increasing your profit margin to make your shareholders happy, then you're going to start cutting essential necessities inside of these facilities, starting with correctional staff. In response to a Bureau of Justice report, the Obama administration actually announced that the Federal Bureau of Prisons would phase out the use of private prisons. Unsurprisingly, after this announcement, the core civic stock value plummeted by about 50%. However, in 2017, the Trump administration reversed the Obama administration's decision and announced that the federal government would not only continue the use of private prisons, they would actually expand the use of private prisons. And so the value of core civic and GEO Group stocks doubled nearly overnight in response to this announcement. And interestingly, the GEO Group then changed the venue for their annual meeting from a resort in Boca Raton, Florida, to the Trump National Doral Golf Club. And I should say that we have research coming out of multiple states, Idaho, Minnesota, Arizona, that point to this issue of violence within private facilities. Then there's the issue of medical treatment within these institutions. So according to the Bureau of Justice statistics, 50% of incarcerated persons suffer from at least one chronic disease and 20% suffer from at least one infectious disease. So we have much higher rates of disease inside of correctional facilities, which shouldn't surprise us because of the poor ventilation systems that exist within these prisons. We're seeing this happen right now with COVID nationwide. Adding to that issue is that within the past 30 years, 29 states have turned over their prison healthcare systems to Horizon, a private corporation that makes $1.4 billion annually by systematically denying incarcerated persons healthcare. According to the ACLU, 660 malpractice suits have been filed against Horizon in just the past 5 years. Now, when I say systematically denying incarcerated persons health care, I mean that these corporations get to decide whether incarcerated people receive any health care for any conditions. It is not a medical professional making these decisions. And I'll give you two examples of how horrific this can become. Marcus Davis was an incarcerated person in Kansas, and he died after a deadly fungus ate away his brain and his lungs. He had been complaining of symptoms for over 6 months at the time of his death. Horizon refused all of his requests to visit a hospital. In 2019, Tammy Davis was incarcerated in the Broward County Jail in Florida. Medical services at that jail are contracted out to WellPath, the largest for-profit private correctional healthcare corporation in the country. Tammy Davis was pregnant at the time of her arrest and went into labor at 3 a.m. A doctor did not arrive until 10 a.m., by which time Tammy had given birth on the floor of her cell without any medical attention. So we see this horrific treatment of these individuals really in the interest of keeping profit margins high for these corporations. But these corporations have also expanded what they charge for to include prison phone calls and emails. Now you must understand that research tells us that incarcerated people who maintain contact with the outside world, with their family, with their children, with their friends, actually have lower recidivism rates. However, private corporations have limited their ability to actually maintain those bonds by charging them astronomical fees for prison phone calls and emails. Although making a phone call and sending email involves minimal out-of-pocket costs for those of us on the outside, the same is not true in prisons. Many states have outsourced their prison phone systems to private corporations. So even within public facilities, there are private corporations operating. And these corporations charge the incarcerated individual per minute for phone calls, much in the same way that we used to pay per minute back in the 1990s and even the early 2000s for our phone calls. But the incarcerated people are price gouged for each phone call. For example, in the state of Maine, a 15-minute intrastate phone call, so a call within the state of Maine, costs $5.30 for an incarcerated person. Now, the FCC at the federal level regulates interstate phone calls. So it's actually cheaper for somebody incarcerated in Maine to call someone in California than it is for them to call their family members within the state of Maine. And as prisons move towards more digital communication methods like email, they've also monetized that service. So for example, JPay is a private corporation that is the sole provider of all digital communications in 20 states. This company makes incarcerated people and their family members pay per page per email at a rate of 47 cents per page. Again, this is very problematic because we are putting a financial barrier between these incarcerated persons and their family members. One of the worst ways in which privatization impacts what's happening inside of prisons is through what we call intrastate transfers. So, some states have begun to transfer their incarcerated population to private prisons in other states. So for example, 40% of private prison beds in the state of Arizona are reserved for out-of-state inmates. So currently, 1,300 Hawaiian inmates are incarcerated in private prisons in the state of Arizona. What that means is that their family members cannot physically visit them because if you've ever tried to book a flight from anywhere in the continental US to Hawaii, you'll know that those are very expensive flights. One woman was featured by the New York Times, and her husband, so she was Hawaiian and her husband was incarcerated in Arizona. It cost her $2,200 to visit her husband round trip. So it would take her almost an entire day to travel to Arizona, and then she would get to spend 2 hours with her husband before starting that very long trek back home. But the effects of privatization extend even beyond a person's release from a private facility. So private corporations have started to come up with new innovative ways to ensure that they maintain financial control over the incarcerated population once they're no longer incarcerated. And one of the ways in which they do this is through debit release cards. So individuals who are forced to work inside of these private prisons, if they have any money left on their commissary or their books at the time of their release, some private prisons are now giving them release cards. And many people argue that this is a good thing because then they don't have to go start a bank account or go through those hurdles. However, many of these debit release cards charge astronomical fees. So they can't take money out of that account without being charged hefty fees. They can't use the card because they're charged per transaction fees. So we're seeing through debit release cards that these facilities continue to make a profit off of these individuals. Even more problematic is when we look at immigration facilities where those individuals are not compensated for their labor, but they're still forced to work. In Colorado, for example, it came to light that the GEO group paid immigrant detainees $1 a day for 8 hours of work, but they paid them with a can of soda and a bag of potato chips. That's how they compensated them for their labor. Another problem on the outside is probation and parole. Many states have begun privatizing their community supervision functions. And to understand why this is problematic, you have to understand that probation is meant to be an alternative to incarceration for low-level offenses that don't pose a great public risk. And ideally, probation officers are supposed to help this person continue to be law-abiding, to have a job, to obey by the conditions of their probation. However, privatized probation flips that idea on its head because the only goal is increased profits for the corporations. So private probation companies like Sentinel charge the probationer, not the state, for their services. And fees range from $35 to $50 per month, beginning the very moment you step out of a correctional facility. Now, failure to pay the fee results in interest and fines, and which are then added to the person's debit account, or rather debt account. Some states have begun using private prisons even as debt collectors. So for example, a person who receives a moving violation in Alabama or Mississippi and is unable to pay that fine outright is then placed on probation, which if you look at the graphic on your slide, you'll notice that people that are on probation who are represented by the orange bars are significantly poorer than those of us not on probation. They're making, over 65% of them are making less than $20,000 a year. So let's say that someone in Alabama receives a $20 ticket and they go to court and they're unable to pay. The probationer is then placed on Sentinel probation where an additional $35 is added to their $20 in debt. Even if the probationer arrives at their next meeting with $20, that $20 is not applied to their ticket. It's applied to their debt to Sentinel because the courts allow the probation company to decide how payments are allocated. So what ends up happening is these people quickly find themselves in debt that they cannot free themselves from because every month Sentinel adds another $35 to their debt. And, excuse me, a report from the Human Rights Watch found that probationers in Florida, Kentucky, Missouri, and Texas would stop reporting to probation when their debts became impossible to pay back. So these private companies are actually making these individuals law violators based on these debts. Once they stop showing up, once they miss one probation meeting, a warrant is issued for their arrest. And then there's the issue of reentry services. It goes far beyond just probation and parole. Individuals who are released are required to pay for many of the requirements of their supervision. And so these services are pretty extensive. And I'll give you an example of a woman I interviewed. We'll call her Mary, that's not her name. But Mary was responsible for paying $25 a month to be on parole. She had to report to her parole officer weekly. During this visit, she was required to submit to a urinalysis drug test at a cost of $10 per test. So that's another $40 a month. She also had to complete cognitive behavioral therapy classes at a cost of $20 per class, plus $30 for the book for the class. She was mandated to live in a halfway home that charged her $75 per week or an additional $300 a month. Lastly, she was court ordered to pay $2,500 in court fees and restitution. She had to make some payment on this amount every month as a condition of her parole. If you add up all of Mary's fees, assuming she only paid $100 a month to her restitution, that is $505 a month in fees, in reentry service fees. Mary earned $960 per month after taxes, leaving her with only $455 per month to cover transportation, food, medical expenses, clothing, and any additional expenses she might incur. And perhaps the most troubling finding of all of my research was that many individuals I interviewed admitted to engaging in crime in order to pay for their supervision costs. So they were placed in this impossible situation where they either had to risk reincarceration by not paying their fees or risk reincarceration in order to commit crimes to pay their fees. And so then there's the effect of privatization on society. What is the point of privatization? The belief was that privatization would reduce state spending and would result in a cost savings to taxpayers. This is how this whole idea was pitched to state legislatures. However, those cost savings never materialized or were heavily inflated by private corporations. A study conducted by the Arizona Department of Corrections, the state with the highest level of privatization, found no cost savings to the state. And it's largely in part to high recidivism rates. So this is just, this chart that you see is from one particular study of 3,500 formerly incarcerated people. Look at 1,766 were held in private facilities and 1,766 were held in public facilities. And you'll notice that the recidivism rates are higher in the private facilities. So when we factor in the cost of reincarcerating someone, any potential cost savings is gone. Moreover, what people don't often know is that private prison corporations get to decide who they want to incarcerate and who they don't want to incarcerate. So it costs different amounts to incarcerate every incarcerated person. So for example, at the Louisville Metro Jail in Louisville, Kentucky, it costs $81 per day to incarcerate one person. However, if that person has some special need, like a mental health issue, special safety requirements, those individuals cost $250 per day to incarcerate. So what private corporations do is they refuse to incarcerate those who have more severe issues. So they're already incarcerating the people it costs the least to incarcerate. So in their annual reports, it looks like they're saving the state money when they're actually not saving them money. And then if you factor in the violence and the lawsuits that come from that violence, there's really very little cost savings. And then there's the issue of occupancy clauses. So when private corporations negotiate contracts with states, they build in what's known as an occupancy clause. An occupancy clause says X percentage of beds in a facility must be filled at all times. If they are not filled, it triggers fines to the state, oftentimes in the millions. Those occupancy clauses are usually between 90 and 100%. What this means is that in some states, if a single bed is empty in a private facility, the state owes the corporation money. And again, remember that they are counting their profits per body. And so they do not want empty beds. A single empty bed means less profit. It means that they'll have to answer to their stockholders at the end of the quarter. And so this is extremely problematic because these corporations are actively working against criminal justice reform. While those of us in the CJ field, or many of us are arguing for reform, for changing the criminal justice system, these companies, especially Core Civic and Geo Group, are fighting against any potential reform. And I'll read you a quote from the Core Civic annual report that sums up this problem. And they say, quote, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal law." That is coded language for saying they don't want the legalization of marijuana and they don't want immigration reform, because both of those policies, although the US public would like those policies to be enacted, these corporations have a financial incentive to ensure they are never enacted. And so Core Civic, Geo Group, and other private corporations spend millions of dollars annually lobbying politicians. During the 2016 presidential election, the Geo Group donated $1.1 million. Core Civic donated $1.2 million. And Management and Training Corporation donated $500,000. And I want to be clear that money is donated in 2016 to candidates on both sides of the aisle. So for example, Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio each received $133,000 from private prison firms. However, no campaign received more funding than the Trump campaign. Geo Group and Core Civic each donated $250,000 to the 2016 Trump campaign. And it should come as no surprise that 4 months into his term, the Department of Justice awarded the Geo Group a $110 million contract to build a new private prison. So while we on the outside are trying to fight for these clear, rational reform measures, we are coming up against these major corporations that have very deep pockets and heavy political influence. And you can go online and you can see just how much money every member of Congress has received from these corporations. So as many states, especially those that do not allow privatized criminal justice services, are trying to implement criminal justice reform, we're seeing a slight decline in the incarcerated population nationwide. And so these private companies are beginning to shift their focus into what I'm calling the new frontier, immigration detention. So if you wonder why immigration has been such a big issue in the past 5 or 10 years, it's because these corporations are pushing for increased immigration, or immigration enforcement rather. So 71% of immigration detention facilities are run by private prison corporations as of November 2017. And you'll notice in the pie chart on the right, CCA or Core Civic is the blue part of the graphic and Geo Group is the red part of the graphic. So CCA and Geo Group own 72% of all private immigration detention facilities. And so if you wonder why we have kids in cages, why these horrendous things are happening, it is largely in part because these private corporations are not answerable to us, the taxpayer, they're answerable to their shareholders. So they have no incentive to put in any semblance of humanity into these facilities. They have no incentive to treat these people correctly, especially when the overall climate of our country is very much anti-immigrant at the time. And so with that, I will turn it over to my colleague who will tell you how we can begin to combat this issue.
Thank you. All right, let me just make sure that I can control these slides here. So thank you so much to Dr. Ortiz for that excellent presentation. I know I get a little bit overwhelmed by how intense sort of the feeling of evil is about these companies. So I'm grateful that I get the job of sharing just like a little bit of hope with all of you today. So as Monica said at the beginning, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I organize a faith-based immigration network here. And we've been working with some amazing partners for over 1.5 years on a statewide divestment campaign from private prisons. And part of that has to do with some of what Dr. Ortiz was mentioning about sort of the nature of them being publicly traded companies, et cetera. So sort of like what are the levers to actually impact them? So we kicked off publicly with an action in early 2019 outside of a local Wells Fargo branch with mariachi music and signs. And you'll see on the slide just a couple of photos from that action. And while the protest was happening on the street corner, a few of us who were in that bottom right picture who are religious leaders, we met inside the branch with the branch manager and a regional manager to discuss our concerns about Wells Fargo's investments in Geo Group and Core Civic. We also sent letters to the Wells Fargo national offices and to all of our local Wells Fargo branches explaining our position, asking them to divest and to end their lending to private prison companies. One of the reasons that we chose Wells Fargo, there are multiple large banks that were doing this lending to GEO Group and CoreCivic, is because that's the bank that our local and state government uses. And so we knew we wanted to eventually pivot our campaign to ending private prisons in New Mexico. And so we wanted to target the bank that our government uses. A couple of months after this big Wells Fargo action, we got the very exciting news that Wells Fargo, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and 3 other big banks were actually severing their ties with private prisons and would no longer be lending to them. So that was very big news, and the reasons were twofold. One was the increasing public pressure on them to do so, and the worsening financial position of the private prison industry due to that public pressure. These banks basically decided that the private prison industry, that CoreCivic and GEO Group, were no longer good investments for them. And these big banks ending their loans to these companies would really destabilize their business model, and it would be very difficult for them to find new lenders because they need billions of dollars of very risky loans in order to operate their business. That's just sort of like the nature of the way that they run their business. So this big move by these big banks was really good news. And after the bank action, we began to research where else in our state had direct holdings in the private prison industry, beyond just banking connections, but direct holdings. And we discovered that the New Mexico Educational Retirement Board was directly invested in both GEO Group and CoreCivic. And we felt like, okay, this is like a low-hanging fruit. You know, educators in New Mexico are going to be appalled to learn that their pensions are invested in these immoral companies that are like harming their students' families. And so we decided that the New Mexico Educational Retirement Board would be our next target. And so over the past year and a half, we have built a strong coalition with educators in our state, with different groups, advocacy groups that work with educators. And we have both publicly and privately urged the ERB to divest its holdings with letters, with testimonials, phone calls, appearing in their meetings, recently online, and just lots of pressure on them. And so you can see in this slide a billboard that we paid to have up during a recent Educational Retirement Board meeting that, you know, says New Mexico educators, our retirement dollars are funding private prisons and migrant detention. And there's also a list of our current coalition partners, which are many. So I definitely want to make it clear that this is not me doing all of this amazing work at all, though I'm glad to be part of it. So there has been intense resistance from the director of the ERB since our first meeting with her. We had a private meeting with her. It was just me and two other people who were part of our coalition early on. And she was extremely resistant to anything that we brought up. And we basically said, okay, cool. Well, we'll be back with thousands of educators pushing to have their pension divested. And the resistance has continued, but we have succeeded in persuading at least 2 of the retirement board members so far that divestment is the right choice for their educational retirement board. And we have thousands of educators who are on board, who have signed our petition, who have attended these hearings. We continue to send representatives to the board meetings to push the issue every single month, write more emails, make more phone calls. We're just being super persistent. And last month, we got the great news that CoreCivic's stock has degraded in value so much recently due to public pressure that by default, it is no longer part of the ERB stock portfolio. So while they didn't actually technically divest from CoreCivic, they are now divested by default. And what happened is that basically the national activism against these companies is actually working. So here I have, The slide's going to change. I don't know. Here I have a screenshot I took of the headline of a recent Forbes article that outlines the progress on this issue. Definitely worth reading. There will be a link to it at the end. And one of the things that this article explains is that Core Civic fell from what is called the S&P Mid-Cap 400 Index to the S&P Small Cap 600. And essentially this means that their stock performance is not good. Core Civic is officially now underperforming in the market. It's considered a bad investment financially. Their credit rating has also fallen to what is known as junk bond status. So I think even for those of us who are not well versed in the world of finance, this is pretty clear. The stocks are volatile, junky, their profits are small. And this is directly because of the public pressure on them, which has left them without lenders in the banking world, which again, they need billions of dollars in loans, and with a very tarnished public reputation due to their involvement in mass incarceration, and especially in recent years, their involvement in immigrant detention, which has really raised public awareness about what they're doing a little bit more. As Dr. Ortiz mentioned, concerns about the private prison industry do date back decades. And there has been a concerted nationwide organizing effort to end private prisons going on since at least 2008. Especially since 2018, though, as I mentioned, when private prison companies moved more deeply into the immigrant detention space, more and more people became aware that their banks and their pensions were involved in financing these immoral companies that perpetuate human rights abuses and profit off of human pain. And advocate organizations in many different campaigns, including the Families Belong Together Coalition, such as Moms Rising, Mamás con Poder, and Real Money Moves, have organized over 600,000 petitions, 500 in-person actions across the country in front of major banks like the one we did in Santa Fe. And in the wake of this sustained nationwide activism, eventually 8 major banks, which represent 87.4% of all known financing for private prisons, announced that they would no longer finance private prison companies. So those of us involved in our local campaign here are excited to be part of such a successful nationwide campaign. And I share some of this with you and hope that you will join the movement too. Faith-based institutions have a long history of involvement in divestment campaigns, including the historic apartheid divestment strategy, fossil fuel divestment movement, and private prison divestment. I read a report from 2018, global divestment report, that faith organizations represent the greatest share of divesting institutions overall, above philanthropic foundations, governments, educational bodies, or pension funds. And so I think, you know, we're very much positioned as people of faith to work on these issues. This slide has a couple of the big wins nationally in regards to divestment from private prisons by faith-based institutions. These include the Pension Board of the United Methodist Church, which is the largest faith-based pension fund in the US, which in 2012 announced divestment of all of its private prison holdings, which was worth $1 million. In the same year, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church created a portfolio screen to filter out private prisons. They encouraged local congregations and individual Presbyterians to divest from private prisons. And in 2017, the Interfaith Bank boycott coordinated $1 million in divestment as well from prison lenders as a means to pressure Congress to pass a Clean Dream Act. Public awareness of private prisons has been reinvigorated even further this summer, particularly because of the problematic response to COVID-19, but also, of course, in conversation with the national uprisings, increased engagement around race, policing, and prisons. Recently, The Intercept reported that GEO Group and ICE working together allegedly tried to suppress COVID testing in order to avoid having to proactively address the pandemic. Internal emails were released as part of the lawsuit against ICE and showed GEO Group and ICE officials actively communicating and choosing not to test for COVID-19 in Mesa Verde Detention Center. knowing that to create enough room for isolation areas would drastically reduce the number of people being held in the facility and would thus hurt their profits. So the examples of the abuses of these companies go on, and Dr. Ortiz already shared a lot about that. But the point is that with the mishandling of the pandemic in prisons and the mass outbreaks of COVID in private prisons, the public has been further activated around the immorality of this business model. And we're making real progress towards ending private prisons. So this issue is really important for the state of New Mexico, and that's part of why we're working on it. New Mexico is actually, maybe after Arizona, one of the biggest utilizers of private prisons in the nation. 53% of people incarcerated in New Mexico are incarcerated in private prisons. This image shows Cibola County Correctional Center, one of our local New Mexico prisons, which is operated by Core Civic. And our network has worked a lot with asylum seekers who've been incarcerated there. But in the 1990s, New Mexico had one of the nation's biggest surges in the use of private prisons. This came partially on the heels of one of the worst prison riots in the country, which happened at the Penitentiary of New Mexico here in Santa Fe County. It also came amidst rising evidence of corruption in the state prison system and with these promises of rural economic development from this new industry. Who also promised to reform the corruption in public prisons. And of course, as you can imagine from what Dr. Ortiz has already shared, these promises certainly did not come true. Not only have private prisons in New Mexico perpetuated human rights abuses and have very poor conditions for those incarcerated, they've actually cost the state a lot of money and really worsened our economy in our rural areas. Private prison contractors are more expensive than state-run prisons. They overcharge the state for their services, and local economies actually end up suffering from the economic drains of these facilities for many reasons. One of the problems has also been that the private prison companies maneuver in and out of the contracts that they have to try to maintain their profits, and they fail to pay the state when they have been fined for violating the contracts. So New Mexico has been totally unable to hold these corporations accountable, and they've ended up really hurting our local community. So I'm excited to share a little more good news about that, which is that in addition to our divestment campaign, we are also part of a coalition that's working on legislation to end private prisons in New Mexico. And there are policy wonk members of that coalition who are actively writing a bill right now for our legislative session in 2021 that will prohibit the ownership, operation, and management of a detention facility in New Mexico by a private contractor. And sort of early intel suggests that we may have the support of some key state legislators on this, which is really exciting and really hopeful. And so I just want to reiterate that there actually is hope in this divestment movement, both locally and nationally. And I know we all need more hope right now. So I hope that you will consider how you can get involved in this movement locally in your community. As Christians, I think it's extremely important that we look at this issue because it's immoral. Private prisons literally incentivize incarceration. And you know, the Bible mentions finances and money over 2,000 times, more than any other topic. And there's a certain slant to those mentions, of course, which is against cutthroat profits. And I really remember that Jesus preached, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I think that's really important to remember when we think about investments, you know, where, if we do have investments, where are they invested? If we have pensions, where are they invested? So I hope that if you do have a pension or if you have personal investments, that you will make sure that they are not invested in private prisons, and look into your local church community too. Find out if your church has investments. Where are those invested? Let's see if I can change this slide. So here I have a list of various resources for that, and those will be in the chat box too. They include like a search platform to find out if your money's invested in prisons, as well as a lot of other information. So I just want to reiterate that as people of faith, I really feel that we cannot allow money to be made in our names through for-profit incarceration, because where our money is, our hearts will be also. And we need to commit to divesting from these industries that harm our community, reinvest in thriving and wholeness for our community. And it is possible and it is working. So let's do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiffany, for all the good work that you're doing. I have a follow-up question for you. You mentioned that you met with the director of the pension fund in New Mexico for teachers, and she was very resistant to making any changes. What was the basis of her resistance? What arguments was she making against the possibility of divesting from these private prisons?
Well, it was funny. One of the things that she said multiple times is she said, well, this is a slippery slope. And basically by that, she meant if we divest from one bad thing, then we have to divest from all bad things. And I said in response to her, well, isn't that a slippery slope you might want to be on? But she didn't feel that way. And she also said, which is not true, that they cannot, because they're invested in the S&P 500, whichever one, that they can't individually choose their stocks, which stocks they're invested in. They're just like, it's sort of like a blanket investment, which is not true. You can choose, what things you want to take out. We work with someone who specializes in ethical investing, and he sort of has clarified all of this for us. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I want to say this on the record, but we wonder if she is receiving money from some people because the resistance is just unbelievably strong. I mean, she's done everything in her power to stop this from happening. So,
thank you. Dr. Ortiz, I have a question for you. I read somewhere that that the federal government has these contracts with these private prison corporations. And I think you mentioned this, that the government has to guarantee a minimum number of beds for these private corporations. Is that accurate, and how has that affected the incarceration and imprisonment of people coming into this country through the immigration channels?
Well, yes, absolutely. In these contracts, in addition to occupancy clauses, if the state or the federal government is not allowing them to build a brand new prison, let's say they're turning over a prison to a private corporation, an existing prison, they do have to guarantee that there are a certain number of beds in the facility. And that is because they need a certain amount of bodies in order to turn a profit, in order to see wider profit margins. And so it is very clear that the immigration processes that we've seen in the past couple of years are directly influenced by those corporations. So for example, the Trump administration tried to shift crossing the US-Mexico border as an undocumented person into a criminal offense. It is a civil offense. It has never been a criminal offense. Their push to make it a criminal offense was so that they would have more justification to hold these individuals in these facilities, so that these facilities could turn a larger profit. Because in theory, you shouldn't be incarcerated for these civil offenses. You should be incarcerated if you broke the law at the criminal level. And so former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, his push to make crossing the border a felony offense was in direct response to their agreements with Core Civic and with Geo Group. Absolutely.
Thank you, Tiffany. We had a question in the chat box, and I'll address it to you and broaden it a little bit. The question is there any divestment or are there any divestment campaigns in the state of Nebraska going on? That's the question from the chat box, but I want to expand on that and ask what steps you would take to advise individuals in faith-based communities to start the same type of program that you've started in Santa Fe.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know the specific answer about Nebraska, but as I mentioned, this is a nationwide effort and campaign coalition work. So I'm sure I would look up like Families Belong Together Coalition and find out if there is any local organizing happening in Nebraska or wherever you are located. The way that we got started with this really had to do with, well, a number of things. We were already working, supporting asylum seekers in a local prison. I showed the picture that's run by Core Civic. And so we were becoming very aware of the abuses of that company and locally. And then also some lawyers who were working there. Basically, it kind of just organically evolved this this kind of idea and coalition to work on divestment. But I would say always, when I think about faith communities, really look for those coalitions, look for those partners that you can work with. I mean, you cannot do it on your own, you know, and so try to find people who are already starting to work on these things and build those connections. And, you know, like we have tried to create specific targets at different points in the campaign, as I kind of mentioned. Wells Fargo, the Mexico Educational Retirement Board. Now we're working on the legislation. You know, we may try to target some other part of our government that's invested locally, but, you know, trying to work with others and to create specific targets that you can build towards the bigger goal. Like I said, too, maybe just start with your own church, too. Find out if your church has investments in private prisons.
Thank you. Dr. Ortiz, a question for you. Are there private prisons in other countries?
Well, unfortunately, whenever the U.S. does something, everyone, like as far as criminal justice is concerned, everyone thinks it's a good idea. I don't know why they seem to think that our system is working, but yes, other countries have followed our lead. The UK or the United Kingdom is probably the worst. So they have less incarcerated people, but a higher percentage of their prisons are privately owned. So England and Wales are close to 20%. Scotland is about 15% of their prisons are private. So they're slightly higher percentage-wise, but because their incarcerated populations are smaller, there's less actual people inside of these facilities. And then there are countries that moved towards privatization and quickly moved away from it. So Israel is probably the best example. In 2004, Israel started using private prisons. And in 2009, the Israel Supreme Court actually ruled that privatized prisons were unconstitutional. So they did away with their privatized prisons, really on a moral legal argument. Places like New Zealand, they have private prisons. Canada started using private prisons. I know of at least 3 of their facilities that were privatized and then later returned back to public or government control. So there's definitely private prisons in other countries, but unlike the US, many of those have actually moved back, they moved towards privatization and then they moved back and made their facilities public again.
Thank you. This is a question that I think we'll leave for both of you. So with the divestment by banks of making loans to these private corporations, is there any movement in the federal government, legislatures, or the Trump administration to continue financing these private prisons?
So I would say that there's a clear incentive. I mean, the Trump administration has clearly moved back towards privatization. I was hopeful there for a little bit under Obama that he said he would slowly phase them out, but they've reversed course entirely. So we're seeing, you know, GEO Group received a $110 million contract to not take over an existing prison, to build a brand new private prison. So I definitely think that the Trump administration has made it very clear that they support the privatization of not just prison, but also probation and parole and all other criminal justice services.
I think that's a great answer. I mean, I don't know specifically if other entities will be interested in stepping in to try to finance these companies or fill the gaps that have been created by these big banks pulling out. But I think, as Dr. Ortiz said, there's very clear financial ties and financial support from our current government towards private prisons, but specifically whether they would directly invest, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
And I would also add that most incarcerated people are incarcerated at the state level. And so it's really important for us to be focusing on individual states and moving them away from private prisons, because divestment is one strategy, but going directly to your state legislatures is another strategy. I met with my state rep to talk about this issue, and he responded, "We don't have private prisons in the state of Indiana." And I said, "We absolutely do have private prisons in the state of Indiana." And he said, "I had no idea, and I've been a legislator for 4 years." So it's really important for us to push our legislatures at the state level to full on ban the privatization of all criminal justice services. It may seem like a lofty goal, but it is possible. New York State did it in 2007. So you cannot have any privatized criminal justice services in the entire state of New York. And that's the type of legislation we need if we really want to ensure that the incarcerated population doesn't suffer these human rights abuses during their incarceration.
Well, we're running out of time. I want to thank both of you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Reverend Kilpatrick.
Thank you, and thank you to both of our speakers, Dr. Jennifer Ortiz and Reverend Tiffany Curtis, for being with us today, and for all of the important information, but also the action steps that we can take to make a difference in our communities and to make a difference in the lives of our brothers and sisters. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. In the chat box, you've seen some links to websites and more information, and we hope that you will visit those sites and learn more about how the work of divesting, how the work of being educated around the prison industrial complex can inform you to make decisions in your local communities. And you also saw the contact information for our panelists here as well. So if you have additional questions, you are welcome to reach out to them. We ask you to join NBA in our work for creating justice. Some of the ways you can be involved and stay informed of our work is to sign up for our newsletter at nbacares.org/enews. There are a few checkboxes you can mark to let us know your interest in advocacy and activism topics. We encourage you to visit the resource section of our website, where you have a multitude of educational materials, articles, videos, and worship ideas for you to access for free. And finally, we ask you for your support. As we all know, 2020 has been a difficult year on all fronts. And so your generous gifts help NBA continue to support creating communities of compassion, care, and justice. Your donations also support our various grant programs, such as our COVID-19 NBA response grants, and we are forever grateful for these blessings. Thank you for your time today. Please reach out to us with any questions, and we hope to see you again in the next, at our next events. Thank you so much. Have a great one.